That's Hail to the Tsar. But the reason I picked it to open today's show, which is about Rasputin, is that the primary vocalist there is Zhana Bichovskaya, who is one of, I think, maybe numerous more modern Russian important people who kind of feel as though Rasputin needs to be reevaluated, rejudged, and rejudged in an overwhelmingly positive light. So that's one of the things we're going to do today. We're going to talk to you about the reality behind this cartoonized vision of Rasputin as this just irrevocable and incorrigible, blazing-eyed fiend and sex maniac and a lot of other things besides the mad monk image. There's a lot of difference from that, but the other thing we'll be exploring a little bit here, and I just want to say also that prior to plunging into this, and we did start talking about this show, this particular episode, 6 years ago. It's like Fitzcarraldo, the Werner Herzog movie. It's taken a long time to get it on the air. But at the time, like I was not any more sophisticated about this than anybody else. In fact, I'm pretty sure when it came up, my first question was, are we going to talk about what happened to his penis? So that's the level I'm operating at. However, I have had the opportunity to see a better way, or at least maybe a smarter way, thanks to our first guest here. Douglas Smith is an award-winning historian and translator, and the author of numerous books on Russia, including Former People, The Final Days of the Russian Aristocracy, and, most notable for our purposes, Rasputin, Faith, Power, and The Twilight of the Romanovs. Douglas Smith, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And so let's begin. Well, we might as well begin at the beginning. So this man is born in Siberia, not born, I think, under the name Rasputin either. You went to Siberia to see if there were things that we still didn't know about Rasputin after all these years. He died, more than 100 years ago. But what did you find? First of all, I just want to know, what's it like to be walking around Siberia asking questions about Rasputin? How does that go over?
It's a lot of fun, actually. Or it used to be. I don't know about what it'd be like to be doing it now in the current situation. But I went out to Western Siberia, where Rasputin hailed from, to the little village of Pokrovskaya on the Tura River. And there's, in fact, a Rasputin museum there. And I visited the museum and met with the couple that have put it together. They're absolute Rasputin fanatics. And it was really amazing experience to be there and to talk to these people, and also to work in archives in nearby cities in Tobolsk and Tyumen, and to unearth documents that have eluded other historians and biographers. It was really fascinating. I am someone who believes that when you research a subject, you need to try to visit those places that they themselves moved through and inhabited. And for me, when I decided to write this book back in 2010, when I first came up with the idea, I knew that I had to really try to visit as many of the places connected with his life as possible.
So he would have grown up, an essentially unmoneyed peasant, a person with very few prospects in life. But the first thing that happens, I think that kind of changes the course of his life, is some kind of massive religious or spiritual awakening, right? He becomes kind of an itinerant believer.
Exactly. We don't know what exactly provoked it, but he did become what's known in Russian as a strannik, which is a holy pilgrim. And in the late 19th century, there was perhaps as many as 1 million of these holy pilgrims in Russia, most of them poor, traveling on foot over the vast stretches of the Russian Empire from church to church, monastery to monastery, in search of spiritual enlightenment. And Rasputin became one of these holy pilgrims. And I like to think of it as his university. It was sort of, what he used as a way of educating himself about the nature of the empire, about the nature of people, about the nature of God and the religious experience. And it was profound in shaping him into the Rasputin that he would become later.
Right. Well, you just say something about the name. Rasputin is not a name he's born with.
Actually, no, it is.
It is, okay. Because I thought I read somewhere that the name referred to debauchery or something. Or has it acquired that meaning?
Well, again, there are all these myths about Rasputin. And that was one of the things I set out to sort of explore when I did my biography, is where's the truth, where's the legend, where's the myth and all that. And Rasputin, in Russian pronounced Rasputin, is a fairly common surname in that part of Siberia. But people would make a play on the word because Rasputnik in Russian is like a reprobate. Mm. And so many began to say that, oh, well, that wasn't his original surname, but that was in fact given to him as a sign of his moral debauchery and what have you. But in fact, he was born Grigory Rasputin. That was his father's name, was Rasputin, and ancestors before. So that is, again, one of these myths. It's sort of like this notion of the mad monk. He was never a monk. He was never a priest. In fact, the title mad monk comes from the name of a book by a really wacky, bizarre Russian priest by the name of Iliador, who was once very close with Rasputin, and then they parted ways, and Iliador was in several plots to try to then kill Rasputin. And Iliador wrote a book called The Mad Monk, referring to himself as the Mad Monk. So all this stuff got so twisted over the decades and century that I really wanted to set out in my book and try to set it all straight.
But the really interesting premise, or one of the major premises of the book, is that, yes, there are, for some of the moments in Rasputin's life, there might be 4 different circulated narratives about that moment. But what's really important, you say, is not what the actual reality is, or not that that's unimportant, but the more important thing is, how does this live in the mind of the Russian people at this moment? Who do they think is living among them and hanging out with their empress? And who do they think this guy is? That's almost more important than who he really is.
That's exactly right, the way you put it. As I said, I set out to try to pull Rasputin, the real man, and his real words and actions and deeds apart from the myths that had sort of encrusted him. And I set out to do this thinking that, oh, well, then we'll get to the truth about Rasputin, and this will be sort of the contribution that I make with the book. But as I was working on it, I realized that actually you need to always keep in mind there are 2 Rasputins. There is the sort of the real, if you will, in quotation mark, Rasputin. And then there's the Rasputin that people carried around in their heads. And you can't understand the one without the other. And in fact, the more important of the 2 Rasputins is the myth of Rasputin, the beliefs that Russians at the time had about him, because those beliefs about Rasputin that developed through a variety of channels were determinant in shaping people's actions, and were determinant in shaping people's attitudes towards the Romanovs and the final years of the reign of Nicholas II.
So speaking of Nicholas II and the Romanovs, he does eventually wind up in their presence. They are, as monarchs, well, let's just say they weren't exactly out there working the rope line, right? They were a little on the reclusive side as monarchs, not necessarily interacting a lot with people. Made for a great Bergman movie, but maybe not a great way to run things. And they, probably Alexandra a little bit more than Nicholas, are very attuned to this idea that maybe some spiritual person, some visionary is going to come and set them straight about a whole bunch of stuff. They've already had a dalliance with one, Monsieur Philippe, and he has actually predicted that somebody else is going to come along who's going to maybe finish up the work that he started.
Exactly right. I mean, you couldn't have asked for 2 worse people on the throne overseeing this vast, complicated, modernizing empire at the turn of the century than Nicholas II and his wife, Alexandra. Both utterly incompetent, not in any way up to the task of managing this transition to a sort of a modern society that Russia was going through at the time. They isolated themselves in a gilded cage in their palaces. They refused contact with key members of the regime, often the aristocracy and members of the military and what have you. And they wanted this sort of quiet bourgeois sort of family, but you can't do that when you're the Tsar of Russia. Rasputin comes along in the fall of 1905, and as the family is so isolated from the millions and millions of people they reign over, they find in him this sort of personification of the Russian people. And they see in him a way of understanding and communicating with the Russian masses. He becomes this sort of channel for them to the people, to their subjects. And this becomes vital in shaping their opinions of who the Russians are, what the Russians want. And they very much begin to listen to him as time goes on, when it comes to very important questions of how to run the empire.
I mean, not only as time goes on, but it's sort of love at first sight too, right? It starts out with there's a holy man out there, and they're like, okay, we can give him 5 minutes, whatever. And then an hour later, they're still talking. The next day, he's sending off a note, great meeting you, keep the autocracy going. I mean, he doesn't have to work his way or worm his way in there so much as, I mean, they're just primed to have somebody like this to talk to. And we should also say, and apologies for just fast forwarding through so much of this stuff, but there's so much to cover. They've got another problem, and it's a procreative problem. They keep pumping out daughters, which is wonderful in most situations, not so great in a kind of patriarchal lineage kind of situation of a monarchy. They've got to have a son, and then they have a son, and he is a person with hemophilia. I'll let you pick up the story and the role that Rasputin then started to play.
Well, you're absolutely right that from the very beginning, when they meet Rasputin in November of 1905, he is immediately offering political guidance and advice. The country is going through what is known as the Revolution of 1905 that almost destroys the Romanov dynasty. Nicholas is forced to make various political concessions. And they look to Rasputin for some sort of guidance about how are we to navigate this very fraught and difficult time. He insists that Nicholas try to maintain the autocracy and not give in to those clamoring for reform and change. And his role as an advisor only grows over the years, sort of reaching its peak during World War I, right before his murder. As to the question of Alexei, the heir to the throne, the fifth child born after 4 daughters, there's much rejoicing that finally there's a male who will take the place of Nicholas II at some point. And then you're absolutely right. They find out when he's quite young that he has hemophilia, that he's inherited this from his mother. There's great consternation. They keep this all private. Obviously, they don't want anyone to know about it. Now, one of the stories about Rasputin is that his hold over Nicholas and Alexandra is the fact that he is able to cure Alexei from his horrible disease. One of the things that I sort of figured out working on this is that's not exactly the case. They do look to Rasputin during those bleeding episodes that Alexei has. He gives very limited advice on what to do. Basically, let the boy alone. Don't let the doctors bother him too much. That sort of thing. Praise over him, what have you. But what I came away with as perhaps more important in terms of explaining the intensity of the relationship between Alexandra, Nicholas, and Rasputin was that they looked to him again as an advisor of sorts. This was particularly true of Alexandra. She realized that her husband Nicholas was a weak man, was pretty much spineless, and he was easily manipulated by ministers and courtiers. And she was constantly sort of searching for a surrogate spine, to use, lack of a better term, to hold up her husband and to insist that he act in ways that she felt appropriate. And she was always saying, listen to Rasputin, act like Rasputin, do as he says. And not only that, but she would even say, use the comb that our friend Rasputin gave you to comb out your beard before your meeting with ministers, and that will give you the strength to resist their bad advice.
Right. This is a tortured analogy, but I'll use it anyway. One person I thought of while reading about his influence on the Romanovs was supposedly the only true spiritual advisor who even remotely ever touched Donald Trump was Norman Vincent Peale, who was very much about positive thinking and the power of positive thinking. And there's sort of a little bit of that here, right? Even in terms of Alexei, he's going to be okay. This is going to be good. Stop worrying. That there's a way in which he brings quote unquote positive energy into the room.
That's definitely true. Although I would say that he also spoke up when he saw things going in the wrong direction. And the most famous of these is in the summer of 1914, really dramatic moment in the lives of the royal family, particularly of Rasputin. There's a crazy woman in Siberia who's somehow lost her nose. We have photographs of this. It's in the book. It's really striking. Who stabs Rasputin, claiming that she's killing the Antichrist. Miraculously, he survives. which is simply remarkable. And while he's in hospital in Siberia, he's hearing that Europe is going to war. This is at the beginning of World War One, and he's sending telegrams back to St. Petersburg to Nicholas saying, "Don't listen to the ministers, don't listen to the generals. War would be an utter catastrophe." And then finally, he builds up the strength to pen a letter to Nicholas, begging him not to go to war, saying, "I foresee nothing but catastrophe, seas of blood, eternal darkness descending upon Russia." It's a truly remarkable document. Amazingly, it has survived and is now in the
Beinecke. I've been teaching at Yale all spring, and I keep thinking I got to go over there and look at the Rasputin letter.
You got to go see that letter. It's amazing. But there again, like, you know, he was not listened to, but it's one of those what ifs of history. What if Nicholas had listened to Rasputin and not gone to war that summer? How would the 20th century have been different?
There's a lot of that kind of stuff, though. I mean, there's this kind of, you know, I forget who said it, but somebody sort of immediately post-revolution, Russian Revolution says, you know, if there were not a Rasputin, there wouldn't have been a Lenin. But there's also a sense, as you're suggesting, I mean, at one point, for example, he is trying to get Alexandra to talk to Nicholas about turning loose some of the food surpluses that they have while the population is starving, and he's writing these notes. He writes notes. I mean, you know, you had to sort of translate them, but they seem like texts almost. He like wrote the way that people text now. It's kind of like lots of food here, everybody hungry, poop emoji, LOL. How about feeding people? You know, but I mean, here's this guy who's giving them really good advice in terms of everybody hates you right now. How about if you gave them some corn and oats? Plus, they're starving. I mean, that's not at all the Rasputin that we get in the comic books.
No, and that's the thing. I mean, this is again that big gap between sort of the real Rasputin and the Rasputin of myth and the Rasputin in the minds of the people. Russia by 1916 was suffering horribly as a result of the war. The war was not going well. And instead of Russians sort of looking at themselves and their society and saying, oh, well, we can see the reasons we're not doing so well, they wanted to look for treason. They wanted to look for conspirators. And so they wanted these easy answers to complex problems. We see that again and again throughout time. And they
including within the last 3 or 4 weeks.
Exactly. And so they're saying the only way that we can explain the dire straits of Russia is there must be treason at the highest levels. And they latch onto this notion that since Alexandra is German by birth, she must be a spy in cahoots with Rasputin. And they are secretly sending all of our army's secrets to the Kaiser in Berlin. And that's why we're losing. And thus the only way we can save Russia is to kill Rasputin, to kill, chop off the head of the serpent kind of thing. Utterly absurd, utterly bizarre, but people really believed this at the time.
And still, in some cases, believe it. I know you went to Berlin, went through the archives, found, pretty dispositive proof that although Germany would have loved to have had a man on the inside like that, they didn't have him on the inside. And yet, I mean, this is a thing that I guess, I know you got letters from some guy in Russia or some other guy writing a book saying, oh, no, he's definitely a German spy. No,
this idea, I said, okay, if Rasputin were a spy, there would be some traces in the archives. And so exactly right. I went to the archives in Berlin and I found a lot on Rasputin. The agents throughout Europe working for the German government were very keen on figuring out, can we get to Rasputin? And if so, how? Is it money? Is it women? What is it? But if nothing else, Rasputin was a true patriot of Russia, a true supporter of the throne. And the idea that he would ever sell out Russia to the West is absurd. In fact, in some ways, you see in some of his writings sort of these typical Russian nationalist attitudes of, the West is morally bankrupt, that we may not be as rich materially, but we possess a deeper, more profound spiritual wealth than those in the West. So, people want, again, a boogeyman, and Rasputin became the boogeyman for Russians, and that they came up with this notion that if only there hadn't been a Rasputin, things would not have gone so horribly wrong in 1917 and all that. It's misguided thinking at its most basic. So
you mentioned the Germans thinking, how do we get to him? Is it women? Well, it wasn't like he didn't have any women already. I think one of the things that attaches itself to the Rasputin myth is the idea that he liked sexy time and was able to get quite a bit of it. He also appears, by your account, to be a kind of a Andrew Cuomo level groper. Maybe you can tell us a little bit. I mean, how much of the whole just womanizing swordsmanship stuff is real?
That is pretty accurate from what I could tell. It wasn't thousands of women as some may claim, but he always seemed to have a woman or two. There was a lot of sort of groping and kind of gross, lecherous behavior. He never would have survived the Me Too moment. Let's put it that way. Amazingly, though, while we know he visited prostitutes in the Capitol, while we know he took mistresses, there's no claim anywhere in the sources that anyone ever had his love child, which is kind of striking when you think of all the stuff they threw at him. No one ever said, I'm carrying Rasputin's baby, which is kind of remarkable. And apparently his wife, Praskovia, who stayed behind in Siberia all these years, and he would always go back and visit her and everything. Supposedly, this is probably apocryphal, but she supposedly said when this was thrown in her face, look, Grigory has enough love in him for a lot of women. So who knows? But yeah, the stories of womanizing, as far as I could tell, are pretty accurate.
Yeah, just one last thing before we go to break here. So the most toxic womanizing story was that he was having it off with Empress Alexandra herself. This appears not to be true exactly, but boy, some of the letters that you cite, I mean, letters that she wrote about how she could just fall asleep in his embrace with her head on his breast. She could, know more peace than she's knowing right at that moment. I mean, let's say taken out of context, they could in fact feed that idea that in fact they were together in a less than platonic way.
Definitely so. And some of those letters were leaked at the time by Iliador, his sworn enemy at that point. I don't put any stock in the stories that they were lovers. She found great peace and comfort in his presence. I would say that she was also an extremely brittle, uptight Victorian woman, extremely proper when it came to these sorts of moral questions. And the idea that she would have given herself sexually to Rasputin is almost impossible to square with all the other stuff that we know about her as a person. Again, this was part of the attempt to slander not just Rasputin, but to slander the throne as a way to help hasten revolution, or as a way to force Nicholas at some point to sort of make some kind of a break with Alexandra and reassert, if you will, his manly role as the Tsar.
All right, we are now going to take a break. We're talking to Douglas Smith. His book, Rasputin, Faith, Power, and the Twilight of the Romanovs, is very much the basis of our show. We'll be back with more of him.
Is this another of your blasphemies?
The woman was sick. I healed her.
Healed her? How, with potions?
With these.
Was your wife possessed of the devil? Did he exorcise her, pray over her?
No, I touched her with these. It's true, Father.
God would never bless someone so steeped in sin with such a gift. It must come from the devil.
Who knows? I only know I have this power. I have always had it. I can feel it burning within me, driving me on. It is here inside me. It is in my hands. And I warn you all, that I, Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, intend to use it. The power is mine, and I shall use it as I please.
That is Christopher Lee. If you recognize the voice, he was Saruman, Lord of the Rings. He's pretty much always a bad guy, and that's him playing Rasputin in one of the almost countless filmic depictions of Rasputin. I should point out that in less than a year after his death, by 1917, they've got silent B movies about him, but he goes on to be played by everybody from Lionel Barrymore to Alan Rickman, Gerard Depardieu, way too heavy to play Rasputin, who's kind of lean and mean, love machine, voiced by Christopher Lloyd in the animated versions. John Belushi played him in a sketch on Saturday Night Live, also too heavy to play Rasputin. And as recently as last year, he was the villain in The King's Man, the third installment of that Kingsman series. So Rasputin never goes away in fiction. In reality, though, there's a lot more to learn about him. He's just kind of not the cartoon villain he's made out to be. We have with us Douglas Smith, author of Rasputin, Faith, Power, and The Twilight of the Romanovs. So we do have to kind of delve into some of the maybe more lurid aspects of his legend. And I guess one of the other things that sticks to him, let's say it's not an accident that there's a Rasputin vodka brand and I think a Rasputin craft beer or stout or something like that. He's supposedly this legendary Andre the Giant type drinker. Now, how much of that is fabrication?
I think that's pretty accurate, in fact. Although what's funny is he didn't like vodka. He definitely didn't drink stout, which I think you're right. It's called Old Rasputin or something. It's brewed here on the West Coast where I am. He liked Madeira. That was his favorite drink, and he was able to down large quantities of it. He was a lusty man. He was a man of great appetite for drink, for women. He loved to dance and would twirl and whirl at parties and things like that. So these elements of his biography are definitely true. He was someone who was uninhibited. He was somebody who liked to shock the elite classes of the capital, the nobles and aristocrats, which is also part of the source of some of this myth. Is much of these nasty stories that, he was so grubby and dirty and he stank like a barnyard animal were just expressions of class disdain on the part of the elites for this unwashed peasant who shows up and is given access to the royal palace and the imperial family, and they're jealous and angry, and they lash out with all these sorts of gross depictions of him, which are simply in many instances untrue.
Really pretty bad table manners, though, right? I mean, like licking his fingers and then having Countess whoever next to him offering his freshly licked fingers to her.
These kinds of things happened, and I do think, though, part of that was simply to shock polite society.
Right.
It was kind of a way of putting a finger in their eye.
And we don't have time for it, but I just recommend people, first of all, I'll recommend Douglas Smith's book to people, but there's this thing called the Yar restaurant scandal, which there are 4 or 5 different narratives, depending on who you're listening to and who's trying to make what point about Rasputin, including the notion that he did say he was stripping Empress Alexandra and took his own penis out to show, what he had to offer her and all this stuff. But I think the reason that that's possible, we don't have time to parse through all that right now, I don't think. But the reason that's possible, Douglas Smith, is like a lot of things seem kind of plausible about this guy. There's enough reality to his high-spiritedness, to his lust and great appetite, as you say, so that you can spin a tale and it's not going to ring false.
I think you're right. I mean, he gave people a lot of ammunition at times. He could brag. He took great pride in his relationship with the royal family, and he would boast about it, which obviously did not go over well with a great many people. He didn't hide his womanizing. He didn't hide his drinking. He liked to say, and it wasn't just something that Rasputin said, it was something he sort of latched on to, is that if you don't sin, you can't repent. And if you don't repent, you can't be saved, which is sort of an interesting way of looking at things.
So if there's one more story or narrative about Rasputin that just hangs around and doesn't go away. He's a hard guy to kill. And we know he's a hard guy to kill in the sense that you mentioned the crazy lady who stabs him, and there are other attempts during his lifetime, unsuccessful attempts to do away with him. But we should talk about the actual nature of his real death. There are all kinds of stories about like how many different things had to be done to him to actually make him die, and who did those things. You spent quite a lot of time making sure that you had a good understanding of what really did happen. So tell us.
Well, it's one of the weird things about Rasputin and his biography and his afterlife is that the two books that did the most to set him up in public consciousness were written by two people who wanted him dead. One, Iliador, who tried to kill him on 2 occasions and failed, and then the other by Prince Felix Yusupov, who in fact did kill him, and then wrote about it in 2 memoirs. And that sort of established, the Yusupov book established the narrative of how impossible it was to kill Rasputin, that he was in fact Satan incarnate, that, Yusupov and his fellow conspirators in the wine cellar of his mansion on the Moika there in St. Petersburg, they tried to poison him. They tried to beat him. They tried to shoot him. Nothing would kill him. And then, they eventually throw him in the river, the icy river of the Neva. And it's only then that he eventually drowns and all this. This is all complete, excuse me, BS. None of it ever happened that way, as best we can tell. Yusupov, from one of the wealthiest families in Imperial Russia, fled after the revolution. He lost everything. He needed money living in Paris. So he began to write his memoirs, knowing this is the only thing that he had to sell to anybody. And he really sort of sexed it up as best he could with this outlandish tale of the murder of Rasputin that presents himself as sort of the Archangel Michael doing battle with Satan in the Book of Revelation. It's a completely fabricated tale. We have the autopsy photographs of Rasputin's corpse, and you can see that he was shot twice in the midsection, once in the back, in fact, probably when he was trying to run away. And the other, what the Russians call the control shot, which was basically a bullet right in the middle of his forehead, administered at very close range. He was murdered in cold blood. He was lured to his death thinking he was going to a party. And in fact, the murder did not save Russia, as Yusupov thought it would, but could best be seen as the opening shot of the Russian Revolution.
So I'll ask you my lurid question that I alluded to at the beginning of the show, because it did come up at the first meeting 6 years ago when your book came out. So what's up with his penis? Is it really true that the penis was preserved somewhere?
No. Sorry to disappoint. Not long after his murder in the 1920s, I believe it was, there was a myth that started that the killers had lopped off his penis, and that it made its way to the West and was venerated as some sort of cultic object among his followers in France, kept in some special little box and what have you. Utter nonsense. And then now you can go to some sort of museum of sexology in Petersburg, and they have something floating in formaldehyde that they claim is in fact the member of Rasputin. The autopsy reports make no reference to any sort of castration or dismemberment or what have you. So again, it all ties into this crazy hypersexualized mythology of Rasputin that, while entertaining, has no basis in fact.
So I'm not that disappointed, by the way. I hadn't pinned my hopes to that. Reading your book, there's a way in which this is a tale that is located, somewhere between 1900 and let's say 1917. But it feels like a very modern story in a lot of ways. There's the way in which kind of fake news becomes truer in the minds of a lot of people than reality. There's also, as you alluded to, a bunch of Russians sitting around trying to figure out why the war isn't going so well. That seems very familiar, looking for someone to blame for why the war isn't going so well. But I'm also wondering if there are other ways in which you feel as though, one of the obvious mysteries is, why are we still talking about this guy? I mean, not that he didn't loom large in his moment, but we're talking about 10 years of Russian history, basically. And it's just, he's never out of the conversation in popular culture. Everybody at least has some idea who Rasputin is, right? Nobody ever draws a blank with that name.
That's a good point. I think, what's interesting is there's very different histories of Rasputin after his murder between Russia and the West. In Russia, in the early years after his murder, there is interest in him. There is writing about him, an attempt to sort of publish documents relating to him. But then, the country plunges into civil war. Then you have, the birth of the Soviet Union. You have the censorship that lasts for decades and decades. And they don't talk about Rasputin, and he sort of completely disappears from public consciousness. Whereas in the West, as you already alluded to, you get movie after movie after movie, books and things. And so the Rasputin never dies in the West, I think, because it's so rich. The whole story of the utter train wreck that is the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the collapse of the Romanov dynasty, it's so utterly dramatic and powerful, and it's complex, and the personalities are large and intriguing. I think this has done a lot to keep Rasputin alive. And this question of how power operates, I think, is also something that continues to fascinate us. Russians were convinced at the time that there were what they called temные sily, dark forces at work, that were the true, if you will, factors in shaping the course of history, that the things that we see in front of us, the institutions and people in power we see in front of us, are not the real people with the levers of control in their hands. And I think this notion of people behind the scenes manipulating and controlling fate is something that we have obviously been kind of caught up with ourselves, with all this talk about, a deep state or global elites led by, George Soros, all of it smacking of anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories, and, basically just utter nonsense, is something that has resonated here in this country in recent years. I think as a result, maybe in part because we too, as a society, are going under fairly large, substantial changes that a lot of people struggle to make sense of. And so they look for these easy ways to explain complicated processes.
Right. And Rasputin is such an archetype, that he's easily applied. I mean, there is right now in Russia a guy who's frequently referred to as Putin's Rasputin, Alexander Dugin. He's a fascist geopolitical philosopher who likes the Nazi part of Heidegger and believes in all these eschatological movements and stuff. He seems like a much more toxic person, actually, than Rasputin. But there's a way in which, and we'll probably have to end here, but it's kind of like the line in Hamilton about who lives, who dies, who tells your story. Even while you're living, who's telling your story and how becomes incredibly important in terms of defining you. And it seemed like Rasputin, even while alive, was this kind of all-purpose tool for almost any kind of argument. He's corrupting our beloved Romanovs. No, he's proof of how decadent the Romanovs really are. And on and on. Whoever's talking at that moment can use Rasputin as proof of something bad, even if it might be a total counter-narrative to the last thing somebody else said.
I would agree. And I think, the one word that eventually came to me after working on this, scapegoat. He became a very convenient scapegoat for people of different political beliefs and persuasions. He became a shorthand way of explaining all of the problems, and not only that, but of putting them on his shoulders.
All right, we're going to stop there, although I could talk a lot more. It's a great book, Rasputin, Faith, Power, and the Twilight of the Romanovs. Douglas Smith, thank you for your time. We'll take a little break, and then we'll really take it into the world of fiction, specifically the Hellboy franchise.
Then I opened my eyes and the nightmare was me! I was once the most mystical man in all Russia. When the royals betrayed me, they made a mistake. My curse made each of them pay, but one little girl got away.
All right, we are back. Time to say some thank yous. starting with the control room where Dylan Reyes is there at the board, overseen by the watchful. And now you're declaring yourself Russian, too, as well, Kat Pastor. And special thanks to Julia Pistel, one of our freelance producers who spent 6 years producing this particular episode. I mean, she wasn't like working at it all the time. But it is like our Fitzcarraldo. We actually had to push an entire life-size replica of the Kremlin over a hill in a jungle in order to get this thing done. So thanks to her. And, of course, Lily Tyson is always around making sure everything is done the right way. She's our senior producer. All right, so it's like Hellboy week on our show because we reran on Tuesday our interview with Doug Jones. We reran our radio show about mime. That's how well we think out the whole, McLuhan-esque aspects of an auditory medium. We do a show about mimes. But Doug Jones is in Hellboy. But now we're going to talk to Chris Roberson, who is the co-creator of the comic book series iZombie and the co-writer of several titles in the world of Mike Mignola's Hellboy, including Rasputin, the voice of the dragon. So, first of all, welcome to our conversation.
Glad to be here.
So explain Rasputin is Rasputin in these comic books, in the movies, but explain who he is kind of within that reality.
Well, he's very much the myth of Rasputin. We don't tend to engage too much with the reality of who he was as a historical figure. He's just this giant, lurking, sinister figure allied with dark powers. And his story very much begins after the death of the real guy, so that we have quite a bit of creative license in how we deal with him.
My understanding is, and if so, this is a great, you should pardon the expression, nerd culture story. That is it true that your first exposure to Rasputin, or one of your early exposures, was Nicholas and Alexandra because of the Tom Baker performance?
Absolutely, yeah. It was in middle school or high school, early on. And the only reason I was interested in the film was that Doctor Who was on it. And so that became kind of like the touchstone for me of who Rasputin was as a person, was this kind of darker version of a beloved character actor.
Yeah, so Tom Baker plays Rasputin in that particular movie. He goes on to become Doctor Who. I think Rasputin is in Doctor Who, too, but I think it's a Matt Smith episode of Doctor Who. I just want to prove my own nerd bona fides by even knowing something like that.
I believe that is correct, yes.
Okay. So talk a little bit about, what do you do with that character? How do you shape him? How do you make him into whoever he is in the Hellboy universe?
Well, very much just as an antagonist, it's not a character whose head we tend to get inside of. We treat him the way that Bram Stoker treated Dracula, as a figure of menace from the outside, and the focus of that we tend to pay attention to is the people arrayed against him, or who are gradually discovering his existence or dealing with. And I in this, I'm speaking of the subsequent stories that I have done with Mike, and not Mike Mignola's original take on the character in Seed of Destruction, where he is involved in the arrival of Hellboy on Earth as a summoning of a demon, supposedly to help the Nazi efforts, but really for his own sinister purposes.
So you could have called your villain anything, right? You could have just made up a name. You could have called him, you could have made up a name like Voldemort or Sauron or something. Explain, what's the allure of taking somebody who already does have kind of a brand?
I would have to be putting words into Mike Mignola's mouth to answer definitively, but I think he just liked the image of it. I mean, with so many of these things that Mike Mignola has put into the world of Hellboy, it's things that had a big impression on him growing up, or that he encountered at an impressionable age. And oftentimes it's like, just as I say, the image of a thing. So like, for example, like a Sax Rohmer novel, he's more impressed with the cover of it than with the actual text. And I think there was just something of the visual, and particularly the striking eyes in those famous photos of Rasputin becomes the basis of this mythologized version of the character.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, particularly when somebody's drawing a comic book, having features that you can latch onto, and the eyes are already kind of famous, sort of well established, and anybody, and they're not as you say, mythologized. He really did have kind of crazy looking, penetrating, piercing eyes. I was sitting here looking at a photo of him in the studio on Douglas Smith's book cover right now, and it's unmistakable. We should say you were a middle school history teacher for a while, right?
I was, very briefly. I atoned for my sins as an unruly student in my youth.
Yeah. So, I mean, in that sense also, the historical qualities of this, the idea that, yes, this is not the real Rasputin. He didn't, he was not able to harvest salt from the tears of angels or whatever it is he does, But there's a sort of sense in which it's probably a little bit more appealing to have somebody who does connect in some way to history.
Well, it's interesting because, I was a historian. I minored in history and was a history teacher for a while. And it's been a passion of mine throughout my adult life. And I tend to approach these stories that I do as historical period pieces, or at least secret historical period pieces. But because of the realities of how Rasputin enters this narrative, Rasputin is the one element that I don't pay any attention to the real history. So while I'm doing exhaustive research of like the period and the location and what's happening geopolitically that might be interesting in these stories that we could then kind of toss a monster into, for Rasputin himself, it is just, the distant image of this guy.
Right. And there's a way in which, well, we should also say, we did an entire show a million years ago about alternative histories. And one of the weird things about Rasputin is, like, he usually, when you're doing that, you pick things that could have been way worse. The Nazis won, the South won the Civil War, just the worst things than even did happen. I think in the case of Rasputin, like, everything that happened was about as bad as it could, unless your name was Vladimir Lenin. Everything that happened, worked out about as badly as it possibly could for anybody close to it. But there's also just sort of a way in which you're tying Rasputin into another historical story, and that is the Nazis in World War II. We're almost out of time, but kind of give us a sense of what's going on there.
Well, yeah, so Rasputin is basically making use of the Nazi occult bureau for his own ends. Tangentially tied to the real history of things like the Anna Nerva, but again, mythologized past all recognition. But it's basically just because, Nazis are very obvious bad guys, and it's nice to have characters who punching them is the right answer.
I like that. That might be a good place for us to end as well. So, Chris Robertson, thank you so much. Co-creator of the comic book series iZombie and the co-writer of several titles in the world of Mike Mignola's Hellboy, including Rasputin, The Voice of the Dragon. We probably should have explained who Hellboy is for people who don't partake of that kind of thing, but we'll have to do that on another day. Anyway, thank you very much for this. Thank you also. You can bring up the music here. You can bring up the Prokofiev right now, Dylan. We're going to say goodbye right now. But thanks to Douglas Smith, thanks to Julia Pastel and everybody else who helped out here. And we'll just sort of let you bask in a little sort of Russian sleigh ride music.